long-standing conflict between traditional Catholics and the hierarchy of the Catholic Church erupted in a spectacular way during the summer of 1988 with the excommunication of Archbishop Lefebvre by John Paul II. I'm Julius Smetona. This is What Catholics Believe. I'd like to apologize for my voice. I am suffering under the effects of a cold. Archbishop Lefebvre was excommunicated when he consecrated 4 bishops without the approval or permission of the Vatican. Last week, we discussed the objections of the traditionalists to the post-Vatican II Church, Vatican II itself, the new Mass, the new Code of Canon Law. To sum up, their position is these changes are changes which have been condemned by previous popes definitively, and yet we owe them obedience as well. The position of the hierarchy is obedience is tradition too. You must obey. With us again to continue our discussion is the Reverend Clarence Kelly. Father Kelly, welcome to What Catholics Believe.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Father Kelly, it's no secret that the traditional Mass which you celebrate is celebrated in many communities throughout the United States as well as throughout the world. And I believe in every one, the local bishop has said, do not go to that Mass. They are not in union with Rome. They are disobedient. You cannot satisfy your Sunday obligation if you attend Mass there. You must assist at Mass, which is sanctioned by us. How do you view this, to put it in blunt terms, condemnation of your work?
Well, I don't think that every bishop has said that. Many have said it. The way I look at it is kind of a repeat of the conflict which existed when our Lord walked this earth. You had the religious officials of the day whose function it was to prepare the world for the coming of the Messiah. The scribes and Pharisees should have been the ones to proclaim that Christ was indeed the Messiah and the Son of God. But instead of doing that, they crucified him. And they did it with arguments similar to the arguments that are being used by the bishops. An appeal to a certain type of law in order to undermine a higher law. For example, our Lord himself went out of his way to make a point of the difference between a higher and a lower law. He said, for example, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? And then he went ahead and deliberately and willfully healed someone on the Sabbath. He condemned them because they said you could not perform certain works of charity, whereas if you had an animal that fell into a pit, you could draw it out on the Sabbath. So what the scribes and the Pharisees did was to make an appeal to a lower law for the purpose of undermining a higher law. And the hierarchy of the church today is doing exactly the same thing. They are making an appeal to a lower form of law in order to compel people to abandon obligations which flow from higher law.
Father Kelly, my understanding is that in order to preach in a diocese, one needs the permission of the local ordinary, the bishop. In order to build a church, in order to hear confessions, in order to perform marriages, one needs the permission of a local ordinary. To the best of my knowledge, in no diocese in which you operate do you have such permission. Is this the case?
That is the case. No permission from the local ordinary. In fact, if the local ordinary were to offer such permissions, I would refuse them.
Let me ask you, Father, how do you justify completely ignoring the local bishops and, in a sense, the whole hierarchy of the church? I mean, this is a very serious thing you're doing, and yet you feel you're right. How do you justify doing this?
Well, to get back to the point is that there is a hierarchy of laws. There are laws which are strictly human laws, whether they are made by the state or by churchmen. Then there are laws which are divine laws, or divine positive laws, that is to say laws revealed by God, and then there is the natural law. So there is a hierarchy of laws, and the higher the law, the greater is the obligation to obey it. In a conflict of laws, for example, if one has a prescription of divine law versus a prescription of what is purely human law, and it is impossible to fulfill both, then one is obviously obliged to fulfill the higher law. So all of these laws that were made by the church, which were good laws, the laws to regulate the functions performed by priests, all of those were good laws, but they were made for a specific purpose. The purpose they were made for was to protect the people and to protect the sacraments, to ensure that the priest who preached taught sound doctrine, that the priest who administered the sacraments administered them correctly, and that they did it in such a way as to edify the people. So all of these laws were made for that purpose. That is the intention of the lawgiver. And now what you have is a situation in which the hierarchy of the church wants to do the exact opposite of what the original legislator intended. And they are using the law, in effect, to actually bring about a result which is different from the result intended by the legislator.
In other words, you're making a distinction between the spirit of the law and the letter of the law, and what you are saying is that in following the letter of the law, you would violate the spirit of the law, which would contradict the whole purpose of the law.
Yes, in fact, there's a virtue which regulates adherence to the letter of the law. It's called the virtue of epikeia, or the virtue of justice. And it takes into account the intent of the lawgiver. And in fact, St. Thomas Aquinas says that if a person adhered to the letter of the law and thereby frustrated the intention of the lawgiver, one would be guilty of disobedience. So you have to determine whether or not you're going to be a Catholic or you're going to be a Pharisee and a scribe. If you're going to be a Pharisee and a scribe, then there is no place for the divine law. But if you're going to be a Catholic, you have to understand the nature of law and the difference between a higher law and a lower law.
Father Kelly, is there any specific canon law which you would appeal to justify what you're doing?
I would appeal to the moral law. If you were to get out any manual of moral theology, you would find in the introduction there would be an explanation of the nature of law, the obligation imposed by law, when law ceases, the circumstances under which the obligation ceases, and even the circumstances under which the law itself ceases.
Father Kelly, I think the main objection most people would have to your stand is as follows. They'll say, okay, here's Father Kelly, here's some other priests, here's even some bishops, and they see that what you're apparently doing is disobeying the other bishops, disobeying the Pope, and they remember our Lord's words, or his own words, which said, I will be with you unto the consummation of the world. What you shall bind in heaven shall be bound on earth. Thou art Peter, upon this rock I shall build my church, and so on and so forth. And they look at those words, they look at the visible institution, and then they look at who's opposing them, and they say, well, no matter how reasonable that sounds, I think I'm going to stick with the Pope.
Well, you know, again, you have to have a little intelligence and a little discernment to understand the difference between, for example, the use of infallible teaching authority by a Pope and a situation in which he is not using that authority. You also have to understand that the guarantee that our Lord gave was that the church would not defect. He never gave a guarantee that a Pope wouldn't defect. He only gave the guarantee that a Pope, in using his supreme teaching authority, would teach the truth. But it's possible for a Pope to defect and become an enemy of the church and of Christ, and thereby to lose his position in the church. A person could take the position, whatever the Pope says or whatever the bishop says, I will do. But what if the local bishop tells you to go to a Protestant church? And if you object, he would simply say, well, I'm the bishop. And there's an old saying, where the bishop is, there is the church. I mean, obviously, you have to make a distinction between the proper use of authority and the abuse of authority. There have been cases in the history of the church in which popes have abused their authority. For example, there's very, very strong historical evidence that Pope Liberius excommunicated Saint Athanasius. And he did it ultimately because Saint Athanasius adhered to the doctrine that our Lord Jesus Christ is truly the eternal Son of God. And Liberius yielded to the pressure of the Roman Emperor. Now, some Protestants have used that case to argue against the authority of the papacy. And in an interesting reversal, the Catholics who are using the argument against us, in effect, you must give up the Catholic faith because the hierarchy says to give it up, they are, in a certain sense, adhering to that same false understanding of authority in the church. A pope is not impeccable, he's infallible when he uses his infallible teaching authority. Therefore, it is possible for a pope to do things which are sinful, which are wrong, and which are even harmful to souls. If a pope does that, if he uses his authority to harm the church or to harm souls, then Roman Catholics are obliged, in the pain of mortal sin, to resist him. If a Roman Catholic did not resist him and died and went to judgment, he could not defend himself by saying, well, the Pope told me to do it.
Okay. Father Kelly, another objection, which seems to me to be actually quite compelling, is that, there's some rather involved and subtle reasoning involved in many instances in the whole crisis, and that how can an ordinary layman be expected to know all of this? Surely God would not judge or hold in disfavor a soul who stayed close to his leaders, stayed close to the Pope, stayed close to the bishop. The second objection tied in with this, it seems that you are putting the layman in the position of having to judge each law a Pope passes or each disciplinary move. Well, in this case, he's in accord with tradition. I will follow him. In this case, he is not in accord with tradition. I will not follow him. That seems to make shambles of the rock of which Christ built his church.
Not at all. It's not a question of each and every individual layman sitting in judgment on every directive and every command and every law. Obviously, to adhere to a position like that would be simply to be a Protestant. That's not the issue at all. If there is a question of doubt as to the validity of a particular law, the presumption is always in favor of authority. We're not talking about a subtle distinction in theology. We're not talking about some difficult to comprehend point of dogmatic teaching, some subtlety of logic. We're not talking about that. We're talking about the introduction of a new religion, a completely new religion with a new form of worship, new moral standards, and new doctrines. In fact, we're talking about a moral standard that even rejects the teachings of the conciliar popes. For example, in the Diocese of Cleveland, you would be very hard-pressed to find a priest who teaches in the confessional what the church teaches about artificial contraception. They teach follow your own conscience, or it's perfectly okay. And if you bring up to them the argument, well, John Paul II has condemned artificial contraception, their answer is, well, that's his opinion. That's his theological opinion. So we are talking about a radical and dramatic break, a new religion, something which has outdone the Protestants. And individual Catholic lay people are responsible before God to adhere to the faith that was handed down to them that they learned in their catechism.
Father Kelly, we see the activities of Father Kung, for instance, Father Curran, and they openly reject church teaching. Father Kung denies, I believe, the virgin birth. He denies papal infallibility. He was
Divinity of
disciplined.
Christ.
The divinity. He was disciplined, it appears, but I see his books appearing on.
He was not disciplined.
Wasn't his license to teach theology removed?
That's not a discipline. A discipline is, if you teach heresy, the discipline for the teaching of heresy is excommunication. I mean, here's Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre. He didn't teach any heresy. He didn't deny any teaching of the Catholic Church. He said basically that the church is in shambles, souls are being destroyed. I am a bishop, and I am going to consecrate other bishops to ensure that the traditional Mass, sacraments, and moral teaching and doctrine will be available to people. And he was excommunicated for doing that. There was no heresy in that. And yet, someone like Hans Kung or Charles Curran, people who teach that the grossest kind of immorality is acceptable, they are simply slapped on the wrist. I mean, that's a clear example of the mind of the hierarchy.
That's a striking one indeed. Father Kelly, how widespread is this teaching? You were in a Catholic seminary. Did you run across this kind of a view, or is this just something which is an anomaly, which just happens, an aberration?
Which, the heretical teaching?
Well, yes. Is this just an aberration of some bad apples who somehow got into the system, or is this par for the course?
It's par for the course. And that is why some theologians have expressed wonderment at why Charles Curran has been singled out for at least some type of hand slapping. But it is par for the course. It was, for the most part, par for the course in the early 70s, when I was in the seminary, for example. They taught there was no objective moral law, that Christ didn't die for our sins on the cross, that the account of our Lord's birth in the sacred scriptures is a myth, that it was just made up, that it has no relationship necessarily to the facts, and so forth and so on.
Father Kelly, another argument which people will advance is that they'll look at the size of the traditionalist movement, and they'll look at the structure of the church as a whole, and they'll say, well, how can 500 million, 450 million be right, and say 100,000 be, or in other words, how can 450 million be wrong, and say 50,000 be right?
Well, ordinarily, that might be a compelling argument, but it is not objectively an absolutely compelling argument. In other words, it is not impossible. It's sort of like the story of the man who never saw a giraffe, and someone told him that there's an animal that has this huge neck, and he says, well, that's not possible. I just cannot conceive of any animal having a neck that large. In other words, in his mentality, he could not conceive that such a thing could happen, but then he was taken to a zoo and he saw a giraffe, and he philosophically reasoned out, well, if the thing exists, then it's possible. So while it is, from the point of view maybe of common experience, difficult to accept the fact that the overwhelming majority of Catholics would abandon the faith, nevertheless, it is a fact. And it is not intrinsically contrary to any teaching of the Church. There's nothing in the positive revelation revealed by our Lord, or nothing in what the Church has taught that has said that the overwhelming majority of Catholics cannot fall away. In fact, we know from the words of our Lord that before the end of the world, the overwhelming majority will fall away.
Father Kelly, one argument I would say in the favor of the traditionalist point of view is the following. You've raised objections, others have raised objections as well, to the new forms of ordination of priests and episcopal consecration. And they said they even doubt their validity. Now, the ramifications of these are just overwhelming, because if these are indeed invalid, then any bishop who was consecrated after 1968 is not a bishop, and any priest ordained after 1968 is not a priest. Could you comment on this particular aspect?
Well, you are faced with the same problem, and the problem is, could such a thing happen? I know myself, if we could go back in time to, say, the late 50s or the early 60s, and someone said to me, this is what is going to happen, I would probably say, impossible, it can't happen. But it has happened. They have revised all of the rites. There is widespread heretical teaching in virtually all so-called Catholic seminaries and universities throughout the world. It is a fact. Charles Curran teaches at a pontifical university, which is a university directly under John Paul II. He teaches there. He's teaching that moral perversion is acceptable. That's a fact. Go to Fordham University, or go to the universities in Rome, and you will find that the things that are being taught there are the things that were explicitly and firmly condemned by Pope Pius X, for example, the last pope canonized by the Church. It's a fact. Just open your eyes, go there, see what they teach, read their books, listen to their sermons and their lectures, and you will find that what they believe, their religion, their faith, is in contradiction to what the popes have taught and believed, most specifically Pope Pius X.
It's impossible in discussing this situation without considering one particular aspect. Always we were, Catholics are taught in a time of crisis, stand and rally with the Bishop of Rome, the Pope.
Yes,
and
you keep returning to that, but you're not listening, I think, to what I'm saying here, Julius. In other words, what I'm trying to tell you is that it is a doctrine of the Catholic Church that Christ is the head of the Church. Okay? That is, that even when Pope Pius X was alive, who was a saint, he was not the head of the Church. He was the visible head of the Church, or the vicar. The head of the Catholic Church is Jesus Christ. The Pope is the vicar, the representative, the ambassador of the King. His job is to represent the interest of the King, to convey to the people what our Lord has taught. It is possible in Catholic teaching for a pope to abandon the King. It is possible for him to defect. It is not possible for the Church to defect. So the answer is, to the people who are confused, is study what the Church teaches about the papacy. And the Church teaches that it is possible for a pope to defect from Christ. That is not to deny the doctrine of papal infallibility. A pope could not teach infallibly anything that is wrong, but he could personally abandon the faith. And in abandoning the faith, he would, of course, lose his position. So that's the answer. The answer is read the teaching of the Church on the Pope. Don't become scribes and Pharisees. Realize that there is a difference between the directive given by a local bishop and the command of Christ to adhere to the truth, to remain faithful to the gospel. So that's the answer. The answer is the Pope is not the high priest of Judaism, Caiaphas or Annas. The Pope is the ambassador of Christ, and he must represent Christ. And if he doesn't represent Christ, then he should be reminded the way St. Paul reminded Peter. Peter was giving a bad example in the early church. He was actually leading people into heretical ideas because he refused to eat with the Gentiles. It was not his intention, but he was giving this bad example. And to giving the bad example, St. Paul rebuked him to his face.
Father Kelly, just one question I'd like to ask about this whole thing. You're saying, the Catholics should study this. And to what extent can the Catholic layman, if he reads these theological things, he reads this church history, to what extent can he understand its ramifications and its substance?
All he has to do is read his catechism. The catechism says that the Holy Catholic Church has 4 marks. 1, holy, Catholic, and apostolic. All he has to do is to try to verify the existence of those 4 marks of the Church in his local parish. Is his local parish one? Do they all believe exactly the same? Do the priests believe the same as Pope St. Pius X believed? Do they even believe the same as John Paul II? Is it holy? Are the people becoming holy by doing the things that are taught to them? Do they go to confession more frequently? Are they purer? Do they watch fewer bad movies and TV programs and read fewer bad books? Are they more charitable? Are they more honest? Catholic, is the faith that they believe adhere to the same faith as Catholics adhere to throughout the world? And apostolic is what they believe apostolic. It's not apostolic. It's about 25 years old. If it were apostolic, they would do and believe what we do and what we believe. So you don't have to have a degree in theology. You don't even have to study theological tracts. All you have to do is go back to your catechism, see what the catechism says, and apply it to your situation. You apply the requirements of the 4 marks of the Church to the Diocese of Cleveland, and you will come to the conclusion, with just a little bit of honesty, that it is not Catholic.
Father Kelly, we're running out of time, and in closing, I know this is a difficult question to answer, but it's such a fantastic situation, it seems, that we're in today. No one could have believed 30 years ago that it would have arrived. What do you have to say to those people that it can't be, that this can't happen?
That it can happen, that our Lord said that something like this would happen, that do not judge it by whether you can conceive whether or not it happened, but judge it by the facts. Look and see and compare.
As our Lord said, by their fruits ye shall know them. An evil tree cannot bear good fruit. I'd like to thank Father Kelly for being